Welcome back here with Dr. Goldberg. Today we're going to be discussing the economics of Nazi Germany. Yeah, not a topic that always comes up. And unfortunately, there's a great deal of misinformation, propaganda on both sides that needs to be relegated, just to the play area such that we can actually understand what occurred. Before getting started, I want to go ahead and repeal plus replace two primary categories of people who will come in the comments section and attempt to derail everything. The first are the hardcore alt-right people who believe that anything said in a speech done by Goebbels or Hitler with the sad music in the background is the sainted truth. These guys were not politicians. They weren't liars. You have to trust them, despite the fact you can look at actual documentation from the regime which countermands promises or claims that they attempted to put forth. And the apologists will just go, it's the blues. The blues are trying to lie. The blues don't want you to know. That type of thing isn't really helpful, okay? Let's treat the Nazis like pretty much any other political party, okay? They accomplished a lot, but of course they got into a war that was destructive. The second category of people would be those that think the entire battle of World War II was oriented around the Holocaust. The Holocaust is all that mattered from the beginning, and they're just here to prove how much more they're opposed to the Holocaust than everyone else. Neither association is going to be of much assistance, and I want people to get a clearer idea. I'm going to try to be more agnostic. I'm not going to attempt too many judgments, although I do have my own biases, obviously. Most of this information comes from the books Hitler's Revolution and then The Wages of Destruction. The latter is the stronger in terms of academic support, but the former is also worth checking out. In terms of Wages of Destruction, Tooze is obviously in favor of economic liberalism, but he doesn't go around with that typical academic air of frequently condemning anything that these people did simply because they're kind of tarred and feathered as far as the historical record. That being said, there are some misconceptions out there that need to be cleared up. So I think we should just quickly acknowledge the situation Germany was in. Geographically, Germany has always struggled because it's landlocked. It doesn't have a lot of strategic positions per se, and so it's always had to be sort of a central empire if it wants to expand. It's had to go east, where east there's territory that you can cultivate. Westward, obviously, you had forces like France and the UK with these large empires, and you might argue part of the reason for World War II, although not all, was that they really felt, and as far as the concept of Lebensraum, blood and soil, they really felt that they were at risk of going extinct, that if they didn't put up a strong front against these other empires, their people wouldn't survive. In fact, you can see the commitment, the seriousness, because I believe it was Dara that when he did a PhD thesis, which he failed, he said literally the Eastern European territories, the Germans are the ones sort of endowed by the planet or by God, whichever, to settle them because they're superior to the Slavs, the Russians. And in fact, the designs in 1942 was not simply to kill off Jews, but also most Poles and Ukrainians. They had to claw that back a bit because they ended up needing a lot of Poles to work in factories for the war effort. So you see how, sometimes fanaticism wins out, other times it does not. But certainly you should appreciate that position. It doesn't justify what they did, but it helps better understand the situation. It's kind of like with Italy, where if you actually study the foreign policy, and I'm writing a book about Mussolini and fascism because there again, lots of misinformation. Italy was trying to compete on the same terms as France and Britain, and you see the hypocrisy of the French and the British when it came to other countries wishing to expand their colonial holdings. That being said, let's move on to the main category. I'm going to briefly deal with this. I know it's a boomer idea, but they say, were the Nazis socialists? Were they free market capitalists? The only reason people ask this question is because they're trying to associate Democrats or Republicans with the Nazis. It's silly, it's petulant, childish. But that being said, as far as the general question goes, the Nazis were definitely not laissez-faire free market people. I would say ideology-wise, they were revolutionary socialists. Like most movements to take power, they made some concessions, but I define someone as a socialist primarily if they support a large, intrusive state and they don't have much respect for private property. The Nazis did not believe in private property. If you were high up enough in the regime, yes, you had your possessions. If you were an average citizen, if you were Jewish, you did not have those rights. And the idea was the volkswagen, the people's community. You sacrifice for the greater good, for the well-being of the nation, or at least the Nazi version of what the German nation had to be. Because the Nazis were not the only nationalists active at the time. They just ended up being the ones who took power and followed particular ends. With that being said, let's just quickly go over the question of socialism, give you some ideas, and then we'll get into the rest of it. Going down here, it's been described as a state-directed economy that wanted to ultimately be more of a state-owned or managed, run economy. There was a lot of debates within the Nazi Party. People will tell you that, well, the Night of Long Knives, that eliminated the Strasserists, the left-wing Nazis. That's not true. It primarily eliminated rivals within the party structure, but there were still left-leaning people like the Minister of Agriculture. Even Hitler himself had some strong left-wing economic views, but Hitler played back and forth because he was a good politician. The Nazis did come to power. They did get donations from large corporations, but that didn't mean that they were essentially stooges, right? That's how they're portrayed by a lot of leftists. So they were just doing whatever corporations wanted. Actually, oftentimes they were telling corporations what to do under threat of fines, imprisonment, or death. So it just gives you an idea. There was a speech in Linz where they said private freedom in the market later on. Right now we need coercion. As far as welfare is concerned, some of this was inherited and rebranded. It was actually developed under Bismarck decades before. But they did ban private charities. In 1941, there was compulsory centralized health care, although it wasn't all run by the government. But some of it was. Work creation. This is similar to like the WPA in the United States. It was, again, already enacted under the Weimar Republic, but the Nazis pushed it, particularly with the development of Prussia, the East. And that would be in February of 1933, you had 289,000 employed that way. March of 1934, 800,000. And unemployment came down, which they attributed work creation to 30% responsibility for that achievement. And the work creation was described as quote-unquote generalized shoveling, right? Essentially, give people work. It's not necessarily going towards a particular end, but at least it gives them a job so that they're not starving or potentially just having to live on other forms of welfare. Then you have the example of the Volkswagen. Hitler wanted a car that would only cost 1,000 Reichsmarks. It turned out that production cost was actually 2,000 Reichsmarks, and you have to consider that the average income at the time was 4,000 Reichsmarks. So the socialist idea, or let's not use it, I'm not trying to use it in a derogatory way, I'm just in a general sense. The socialist idea was only $1,000 or 1,000 marks it costs. In reality, 2,000, that's 50% of a person's income in a given year. And not everyone was even making 4,000 Reichsmarks. So you see how expectations versus reality, they don't always play out properly. This particular program, they had 270,000 sign up for like a pre-waiting insurance program, and that brought in 275 million Reichsmarks, but none of the cars were actually delivered to those people. You look at these programs, you have to understand, of course, Germany was highly agricultural, and that played into a lot of their policies, which we'll talk about just a little bit in terms of land reform. But there were a lot of poor people in Germany, and unfortunately, during the duration of the Nazi regime, that didn't necessarily improve. Just to be clear, though, because people try to make a contrast, in most socialist societies, the well-being of poor people, left-wing socialist, or more exclusively left-wing, because I don't think it's right to call the Nazis right or left-wing exclusively, the poor have not exactly risen up that much. in most socialist societies. So it just shows you how a lot of people think you can turn the state into a mechanism to better people's lives by creating jobs, creating programs. Perhaps it works in some areas, in others it tends to fail. Spending-wise, this is very brief, but 1934 military was 50% of the overall spending. And in 1933, similar to what we have in the United States, the military gets to be off budget. And this was part of the strategy to avoid the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, because they could only have so large of an army. They couldn't produce certain numbers, and that ended up being some way to get around the rules. So, as you might imagine, these were not fiscal conservatives. They weren't about balanced budgets or anything of that nature. We get into land reform. The idea was to collectivize the debts of all farms, establish a program that would effectively end the agricultural free market, because you're supposed to maintain certain prices and work towards the common good. There were rules in terms of inheritance, what you could do with the farm. This goes into the blood and soil concept, how they were going to develop the East. You need to move Germans there, and they thought agriculture was a big center aspect to that objective. But the collectivization of farms did not entirely go forth, so it's an important distinction to make. That doesn't take away the spirit of it, right? So if someone campaigns and they say, I'm a democratic socialist, and they don't get to implement all their policies, do we say they're not a democratic socialist? Well, no. Philosophically they are. It's just that the realities of being in power can change how you approach different issues. And they had a bad harvest, so that was when there was a request for a farm bailout so they could purchase imports. One of the things that Germany struggled with, it had to import a lot of stuff, especially raw materials, and in particular oil. So that's going to play into, again, why they were so obsessed with expansion, because they didn't feel they could survive in a sort of autarchical sense, just within the borders that they possessed post World War I. And that was, of course, after losing the Saar coal fields, the Ruhr. These things had a huge impact on their ability to thrive in their own eyes and be strong enough, be formidable enough. In one instance, they actually slaughtered pigs in order to set particular prices on ham. But hell, we're seeing that now with coronavirus, I believe. If I got that report right, maybe it's just fake news. And then bureaucratically, again, this is where you see more state intervention. They didn't want to devalue their currency because there was a lot of movement, like in the 30s, the 20s, and the 30s, towards leaving the gold standard, various countries devaluing. The Germans didn't want to do it. They had a big crisis with foreign exchange reserves. And the way they got around with it is expanding the bureaucracy and putting in place price controls. That was almost their solution to everything, was to cut production quotas, to put in place price controls, restrict what you could purchase. So, for instance, in 1936, you had a 15% cut in steel production because they thought that was getting out of control. Or they would cut consumer goods in circulation, limit how much you could actually have available to buy, even if you had the money. They used a program of rationing and national saving. And what that did is, especially when they were running low on foreign exchange reserves, they would say, okay, we're going to give you a really good rate if you put your money in the bank or in the government bonds, as opposed to, let's say, private investment, the stock market. But we're also going to limit the goods that are available to purchase. And so, in effect, the government had all this money. You might be earning more money, but you didn't have anything to spend it on. So yeah, you could be doing okay statistically, but are you actually able to consume a lot? If you compare Germany with like the United States, with the UK, with France, if the overall economic statistics were doing good in Germany, didn't mean it reflected like individual families, what they could afford based upon their income and really what was available on the market. 1933 law to help cartelization of companies. That law removed protections from those who didn't join the cartel. So there was definitely encouragement to be part of that cartel, control prices, control production. 1936, They seized the assets and savings of various people. They also raided local banks and governments for money. This is again going back to the foreign exchange reserves problem. And this netted 473 million Reichsmarks from the citizenry. They would also pressure local banks to buy bonds and not so much stocks. There was the order on economic sabotage. So if you held currency reserves, gold, francs, pounds, whatever, if you tried to store that away from the government, it was considered to be essentially punishable by death because you were betraying the cause of the nation. You were hurting the financial picture of the country. Then when you have the Anschluss, they said that the Jews in Austria had like 8.5 billion Reichsmarks of assets, 7 billion of liabilities. So the idea that we were going after these Jews that were subverting the empire, at least in that case, didn't quite play out. In fact, some of their policies towards Jews were kind of contradictory because they wanted them to emigrate out of the country, but then they would charge them such a high tax to leave that many of them were unable to. Because initially they were sending many of them to Palestine, or the plan, of course, was going to be Madagascar. So they, in effect, wanted the Jewish money, but they wanted them to leave, but they wanted their money. But sometimes they wanted too much, and so they couldn't leave. The order put out by Hitler said that all Jews were responsible for the individual actions of Jews, and that's why with Kristallnacht, even though these were largely Nazi or Nazi-affiliated people who were, smashing up shop windows, much to the chagrin of Goering, he said, "You are destroying this valuable glass," in the various cities. Well, the government turns around and blames the Jews for the Nazis attacking them and says they have to pay for repairs and also fine them like 1 billion RM. You also have examples of coercion of corporations and executives. So there was an instance, I believe it related to Junkers and production, I want to say aircraft, I could be getting that wrong. The answer, because this particular person did not want to give free rein to the government with a particular production facility, the answer was confiscate the whole business if they disagree. You're going to lose it if you don't do what we want. You had the example of Stapelfeld, who was arrested for skepticism on submarines. Closer towards the end of the war, death penalty for defeatist attitudes. Bank executive shot. There was a mining company threatened with fines or imprisonment if they didn't fund creation of a new plant to help with the raw material issue. Moving on to taxes. This is something that I've heard even in the modern sense about the rates of taxation, but in the 1930s they were like the highest taxes in Europe in Germany. High fuel tax because they had to import most oil. 2 to 4% tax on turnover as opposed to profits of a company. In 1940, the corporate profits were so high, though, that Wagner wanted a 20% reduction, and Hitler was actually embarrassed by how well corporations were doing. It made the whole, people's mission look bad, I suppose. They had a tax on employers of foreigners. In 1941, March, the corporate tax was between 40 and 50%. By January 1942, it was up to as much as 55%. They wanted to increase taxes further to have more revenue, but Hitler said, let's delay that until after the war, and he said, yeah, we'll put in place a tax of 25 billion additional RM, Reichsmarks, at that point. Their taxes were so high that at a certain point they said, there isn't much more that we can raise. So it's kind of interesting. And Goering actually wanted what was called a Dankensopfer, basically a Thanksgiving tax that would be paid for the good of the nation. Housing under the Weimar Republic, 42.4% of housing was financed by the government. Under the Nazis, it was closer to 8%. There was more private building, but home building or home construction actually collapsed, especially in the first 5 or 6 years of the regime. And again, they had a kind of people's-oriented project. The idea was a house that would cost only 3.5 Reichsmarks, but actually, that was the ideal, but of course it actually costs 6,000 Reichsmarks. So it just shows you how expectation versus reality with a lot of these government programs doesn't always play out well. But at least I suppose the intention was good. With labor, you hear about the economic miracle, and then of course you heard about the Speer miracle with war production. Under that particular scenario, people were actually working 72 hours a week. So, as you see, sometimes the overall macro picture doesn't reflect the realities that individual people go through. You also had protections for artists, and in general, if you were in a particular field, changing was very difficult. So if you were a metal worker and the nation needed more metal workers, you couldn't switch to another profession. That was very difficult. There were also limits on wage increases, so a lot of companies would use promotions as an excuse to give people more money. And wages did rise, not in all cases, but in many industries they did. But of course, you have that problem of restriction on consumer consumption. So you might be making more money, but you're not necessarily able to buy further things. And thus, you're somewhat stagnant economically, even though you might have a lot of money and much in the bank or invested in some sense. Economic policies, the banks did okay, but not as well as other war industries. You had restrictions on foreign materials, and then they had to actually subsidize exports in most cases to remain competitive. Now, most countries nowadays, and even back then, did the same, so I wouldn't use that as a strike against them. Looking at some of the outcomes of these policies, and again, some of these dates, they're not going to be exactly pinpointed, but you say roughly beginning to mid-1930s. You had a 1 kilogram loaf of bread, which that was half hours of work for most employees to purchase that. 250 grams of butter, that was more than 1 hour's wage to afford it. A typical household food, drink, tobacco budget was 43 to 50%. Rent 12%, utilities 5%, and many people were living in conditions where they didn't necessarily have running water or electricity. Now, to what extent this was uncommon, it's hard to say compared to other countries. You have to remember, of course, Germany, much like Italy, very large, rural, agriculture-based population, so less likely you're going to have the most developed technology there. Excuse me. By the information presented by Tooze in the Wages of Destruction book, Germany was like 25 to 30 years behind the United States. Their economy would be equivalent to modern-day Iran or South Africa, which South Africa might be a little bit better than Iran, depending on what you're looking at. They said that the Anschluss added 8% to the overall output of Germany, but if you look at all the occupied countries, there was not growth throughout the war. Now, maybe that's not so surprising, but of course, you have to realize a lot of the Nazi economic policy, and maybe it was driven by necessity, but I'm just pointing it out, was this idea of essentially confiscation. You see it multiple times with the foreign exchange. Well, we don't have enough. What are we going to do to cover our obligations? Okay, we're just going to go and seize assets from citizens, from Jews, or we'll invade this country and strip them of a lot of resources. And that's one of the reasons I think you didn't see a lot of growth is because they were basically taking what was valuable, bringing it back for the war effort. And there was a lot of talks, like already starting in 1938, inflation, and by the end of the war, I think the statistic I saw was from between 1944 and 45, not even a full year, the circulation of paper money had increased by 80%. So it's the typical thing. Governments spend a lot more to fund projects. They were only covering towards the middle of the war. They were only covering like 54% of expenditures with taxes. So you're running a very large budget deficit, kind of like governments today. And with that being said, I don't know if the Nazi regime economically would have survived long term. I think if they had stayed with the leadership of Hjalmar Schacht, there's a possibility because he sort of kept things in the sane territory. But as far as the policy of constantly trying to confiscate going after stripping resources from various regions, if they had not at a certain point pivoted and come back to more of a peacetime economy, I don't know how successful they would have been at combating inflation on the longer run. And you see that in 1946, which that might be a little bit unfair because they were just after a major war, but GDP per capita in 1946 in Germany was the same as the 1880s. So, what ultimately can be said about Nazi Germany, I think, like any idealistic political movement, they had certain objectives. The only problem is you run up against the reality of the world. And if you have people cooperating with you, it's easier. But of course, in their case, in their situation, it was difficult to do so. And there were some certainly negative outcomes to their policies. But hopefully that was useful to you. And if there's other historical subjects you want to see me discuss, let me know in the comments.